we've seen pain in a very black and white way. Pain is bad. We need to get rid of it. But actually, maybe it's not all bad. And then if that's the case, what are the benefits? And can we find them in some sort of way? And does that make our experience of that pain easier and better? And even maybe there are parts of it which lead us to grow in some way, even if we haven't chosen it.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking. Yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
This episode of Better Thinking is with Brock Bastian, who's a social psychologist, and we look at the concept of pain, how it can enrich your life, how important it is to have plenty of pain, and obviously the difference between harm and pain. One of my favourite episodes because I think it's so important to experience this concept of pain, that it's, the other side of happiness, which is Brock's book, and how the research goes out and shows the connection between pain and enrichment in life. Brock, welcome to the show, and thank you for coming on to discuss not only your book, but also the work that you've done in this space around happiness. I think you've got an extraordinary perspective of this space of happiness and pain, which we'll obviously go into. And I'm really looking forward to sharing this with all of our listeners.
Great. No, thanks for having me, Nesh. It's a pleasure to join you on the show.
Brock, something that stood out, so obviously in this show, Better Thinking, we're always looking at different perspectives that people take with regards to human psychology, evolution, the like, and how to live a better life. And one of the things that I think in doing the research that came out from your work is very much a different angle on what happiness is, or where it comes from, or what some of the contributors are. So I was hoping maybe I could ask you about, how's this sort of work come about for you? Is this something that you've been toiling for some time? Obviously, you've done a lot of research in this sort of space. Is it something personally that you've experienced?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had like a really compelling personal narrative to put to this. I don't. It's too bad. But no, I mean, I think at some point when I was studying psychology and doing my PhD, positive psychology was quite a big thing, and still is. And I liked the I like the sort of premise of positive psychology, which is really, and to be honest, I think some people have referred to me as a positive psychologist in terms of looking at, I guess, human flourishing, how we can build protective factors and address well-being, as opposed to only dealing with problems once they arise. So a kind of preventative early intervention sort of way of thinking, and looking at the strengths of humans as opposed to just their weaknesses. So I really like that. But I did feel that there was a bit of too much of a focus, I suppose, on this importance of happiness, and that actually that this could be, this could be counterproductive in some ways as well. And certainly there's some research around, and there was at the time as well, suggesting that again, if we focus a lot on happiness or push towards that as a goal, that it can be counterproductive. But as a social psychologist, I was particularly interested in how this might play out in our social worlds. I'd also been trained in ACT. I did a bit of work on not in academia, but more applied work, and had taken a few courses in ACT, and really liked the whole acceptance and commitment type approach and this notion of acceptance. But it occurred to me as a social psychologist that that when people left the therapy session, that they'd walk out into a world which didn't seem to have sometimes those sorts of values, that actually it was fine to feel certain negative emotions, or that that it wasn't, you didn't have to always be happy, or it was, perhaps the value of always keeping up that positive front wasn't perhaps always the best way to live. So I started doing some work looking at I guess what some of these pressures for people might elicit, what it might be like to live in a world where you feel that other people want you to always be happy, which is a good thing, but also on the flip side, expect you not to, or think that you shouldn't, express too much anxiety or depression or other sorts of negative emotions. And certainly we found in our work there that, that those sort of perceived social pressures and what we called social expectancies had negative implications for well-being. In some of our more recent work, we found using network analysis, in fact, that actually those social expectations are quite central to depression, to the network of depressive symptoms rather than peripheral. So, even there, I find that sort of interesting that the social norms can actually sit inside the network of symptoms of depression, and the way that we might feel a certain pressure to be a certain way can actually be counterproductive.
The comparative norms, meaning that's
yeah. So, well, not just comparative, but I guess it's not just the descriptive, but also the prescriptive norm. The idea that that we should be happy, and that,
yes.
that being happy is important. And again, I think this message in part, only in part, came a little bit from positive psychology, in as much as it emphasised heavily the importance of happiness and the importance of positive emotion for flourishing, but also inadvertently set up this sort of expectation, or this idea that people felt pressured to try and always feel that way, and if they weren't feeling that way, that they experienced themselves as a failure. So I that's where I liked some of the thinking of ACT around getting comfortable with some of those more negative experiences, and certainly in the research found that the less that people experienced pressure in their social worlds, the more happy and healthy they were, in fact, rather than the other way around. So that's on the sort of happiness side, and perhaps the downside of overemphasizing positivity and the importance of happiness. And there's somewhere along the way I started getting interested in what are the value of our negative experiences? How can we talk about these in a different kind of way? And I thought, well, if we're going to start to think about that, probably the best place to start is just pain. And I started studying physical pain. I thought, if we can find an upside to physical pain, then we can probably find an upside to anything. So we started looking at physical pain in the lab. We'd expose people to painful experiences, mostly putting their hands into ice buckets, because that's the easiest way to do it, experiment.
We're allowed to ethically these days. If it was 50, 60 years ago, we could come up with other pain measures.
Exactly. Yeah, all sorts of things. Yeah. It's funny, some people have often, worried that we were exposing people to these painful experiences. But to be honest, I think most of our participants enjoyed that experience more than answering a 50-page questionnaire. So, I think that's more.
It's actually, it's quite interesting, because even when we think about how psychology goes out and tries to approve, ethics of studies, we're very adverse to, this idea of pain, what's allowed, this kind of terrible fear of, trauma, and, anyone feeling anything that they don't want to feel or is more than what they would usually feel. Even within our own studies, it's a challenge where we're very limited to how we can, for example, do pain now. Certainly not suggesting you go back to some of the old days. There was some strange things that happened back then, but it seems like the pendulum has swung somewhat.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things is that we confuse pain with harm, and I think that's where we think that if people are experiencing pain, they're experiencing harm, and I think there's right there we need to tease those things right apart, because it's not the case. A good example of that, in fact, is self-harm, and the functions that people perhaps try and achieve through self-harm. One of those is emotion regulation, and we know that that it sometimes causing having a painful experience, a physically painful experience, can regulate our negative emotional worlds. Internally, it helps us to kind of escape from that. And in actual fact, some of the stuff that we've looked at, it and other people have looked at, I think, you can actually get that kind of benefit from a range of painful experiences which might not involve the harm. And in fact, you're better off doing it obviously in that way, because the harm afterwards, people feel guilty and shameful for having caused harm to themselves. But the benefits of the pain associated with that can be accessed through just, a hard workout at the gym or going for an intense run. I mean, these things actually are very good at regulating our internal negative feelings. So again, we often think about pain and harm, even in that space, sometimes I think as fitting together or as overlapping too much, and not all pain is harmful at all.
That's an amazing distinction. I've actually never thought of it in that way. That what keeps us so avoidant is this connection between pain and harm. When to do really, at least in my view, really strong psychological work with clients is psychologists who are willing to ask their clients to come and step into pain immensely. And without the fear of I'm harming them. I don't want to re-traumatize. They won't be able to handle it. I'm not sure if it's too much. If they're crying and that confidence and appreciating it is so important. That's kind of what you're saying here, is that we're not necessarily looking for harm. We're looking for pain, and there's a function to pain.
Yeah, there's an upside to it, and there's a function to it. It's certainly unpleasant, but then that's part of it. It's the unpleasantness which actually provides the function, which is what makes it important. But yeah, I mean, obviously too much pain can become harmful, so we're looking at moderate levels of it, and you can re-traumatize people and all of that, and making people put their hand to buckets of ice that are too cold for too long could probably cause some harm as well.
Certainly.
Maybe unlikely in that case, but still there'd be examples. So,
but it's the extreme versions. It's when it's taken too far. I mean, we know that clearly people can get frostbite and things if they're extreme or rigid in the way that we do things. And
exactly, and traumatized. And traumatized as well. So yeah, I think it's about understanding. Yeah, there is certainly a an important argument for for the amount and intensity that the pain needs to be at in order to have positive benefits for us. But yeah, certainly it's not all harmful.
So this is in some sense trying to just summarize that, kind of shaped from this over emphasizing the importance of happiness, that people should be happy all the time, that's our norm, and, we should strive for joy, happiness, feeling good, etc. And maybe, missing another piece of the puzzle, which is that potentially some of these painful experiences might have some upside, might have some benefit or some value in the picture.
Well, yes, there's two parts to that. I mean, I think the first is that that sort of focus and search for happiness, the fetish with happiness, if you like. And again, wanting to be happy and searching at happiness, I think, is absolutely great and positive and I think important. I think it's when it leads you to feel that your painful experiences, your failures, your upsets, these sorts of things, your feelings of depression, anxiety, are actually interrupting your ability to live a good life. And that's when it becomes problematic. It's when you start to devalue those experiences and see them as problematic. As things that need to be medicated, eradicated, those sorts of ideas. That again, if I'm feeling depressed today, well, I'm failing in life. I need to feel happy in order to be successful. I mean, even that idea there, I think, is problematic. So it's not. So the first part to it is that focus on happiness leads us to devalue those experiences, and when we devalue them, not only do we not get the benefits from them, but we also respond to them quite badly. We're much more likely to suffer and get caught in feelings of depression, anxiety, if we struggle with them and find them as things we need to try and get rid of, rather than sit with them comfortably and explore them in some sort of way. And I think it's very hard to explore something which is simply seen as bad or negative or or as failure in some sort of sense. So we need to change the narrative around those in a way which allows people to go, okay, that's an interesting experience. It's unpleasant, but hey, maybe there's other elements to it which could be quite important for my life. And, there's a whole lot of those. So at the highest level, I think it's just a recognition that the way that we're made as humans, if we didn't have these sorts of experiences, we wouldn't even know what happiness was. You really can't, endless happiness in our current state as humans is not possible. You become numb to it. Aldous Huxley wrote about that in Brave New World, the idea, a world in which we could eradicate all our suffering, and it was a sort of dysphoric future. It was a dystopia, not a utopia. So I think as we
why so? Why so?
Well, so I mean, okay. So I mean, if you take a classic example, and I think any pleasant experience becomes somewhat unpleasant over time. You jump in a nice hot spa, it's beautiful, it's wonderful. But if you don't jump into the plunge pool in between times, it starts to become a little bit, you acclimatise to it, and it doesn't actually feel as good anymore. Chocolate, very rewarding, very pleasurable experience. Eat too much of it, continue to eat it without stopping and doing something else, you'll end up feeling sick. There's very few pleasurable experiences in life that you can just have endlessly. And in actual fact, a lot of the pleasure that we experience is often the flip side of which is often it can't exist if the opposite wasn't also true. A good example would be the study, for example. I mean, it's a really great thing to study and pass a course and feel that you've achieved something. But if the possibility of failure wasn't there, if you couldn't have failed that course, if that wasn't even a chance, then you wouldn't even feel any kind of sense of achievement. Certainly, no one would congratulate you for passing a course you were inevitably determined, predestined to pass, right? Where's the achievement in that? So you have to have this other kind of experience to even be able to access some of that good stuff in life. Those other experiences have to be there, if not as a reality, at least as a possibility. And so that's what those experiences give us. So, I think if we were just endlessly happy, we become endlessly numb at some point. We acclimatise as humans to things, we adapt. And so without some variation in our worlds, we go numb, ultimately.
And is that somewhat in our biology? Is that connected to something?
Well, I mean that's how we've managed to survive even the unpleasant experiences in life as well. So we've managed to adapt as humans, and these experiences are things which over time we can actually sort of accommodate into our worlds. But it goes in both ways. So just the same hardware that allows us to deal with those sort of difficulties and harsh environments we've had to deal with, throughout evolutionary history. That same hardware also means that we acclimatise to the positive, pleasant experiences as well. So that we end up just these things tend to, without some sort of contrast, without some sort of edge to it, we don't notice it as much anymore. So we need that contrast or that edge to the experience in order to really be able to have it in the first place. We really appreciate those sorts of things much more when we've got the contrast, when we've had the opposite or the possibility for the opposite. The appreciation, the engagement is much higher.
So many things are triggering in my mind in terms of having that appreciation due to the contrast. In relationships, so many of us just want our relationships to go well. To always be happy, and it's almost like this ideal is what we're searching for. But in actual fact, it's clearly not ever possible to live two simultaneous lives that are always in agreement. And in actual fact, is probably not what we're looking for, because it doesn't challenge us. It doesn't challenge us, ask us to do different things, have different experiences. You may as well be alone, because the other person is thinking what you're thinking, doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
you're kind of by yourself because you're with yourself.
Yeah. Well,
shift.
we also know that relationships where there's some conflict and stress earlier on become more robust. So again, it's. I mean, if you think about, again, often, those relationships that are strongest, where you've had a bit of a disagreement with someone, but you've come through it, or you've had some sort of conflict, or had to have a tough discussion, but you've come through that together, and actually that's a strengthening. That leads to a strengthening that relationship. Relationships where you've just floated along the surface and never had to engage with that sort of discomfort. They're not as strong. And as soon as a bump or a bump in the road comes along, they fall apart. So it's right. Strong relationships require engaging with some of that discomfort as well as just the pleasantness of it. Yeah.
Why is that? I mean, I have a look at it, and obviously that's how family, is so robust. They go through such hard time, relationships. I know previous former training, I went through the military, and some of the blokes in particular that I went through, recruit course in, was immense pain, and it's not just the physical; it's sleep deprivation, it's being yelled at, so on and so forth. Plenty of stuff, but we walked out as brothers, that we were, and this is what that camaraderie is, right? What keeps stuck and glued, and probably why their retention rate is probably quite well in terms of once people have been through, they stay for a reasonable time, because who's going to leave their brother? I'm with my brothers, with my mates. What is it about hardship? That adversity that brings us connected closer. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, firstly, that rituals, social rituals throughout the world, are strangely painful events. So if I guess persistent throughout times and across cultures, there are a lot of rituals that involve an element of pain. Some very extreme, like the Kavadi festival, for example, where in Mauritius, where people actually literally sort of engage in pretty horrific acts, actually. But throughout history, sorry,
what do they do?
What's that? Oh, it involves piercings and all sorts of quite. I mean, there's different levels of it, but certainly. So one study that looked at that found that people who engage in the sort of low intensity, which was just prayer and fasting and things like that, versus the high intensity, which involved body piercing and all sorts of, I suppose, really quite painful demonstrations of commitment. They found that it was not only the actors but also the observers of those more intense rituals who gave more money to the temple at the end of the festival. And we find this has been demonstrated elsewhere, just in a more benign context. Other research as well, that whereas you would think that if you engage in all that effort to I guess to a cause, that you might feel, well, now I don't need to actually contribute more to that cause, but actually it increases commitment. Effort increases value. In marketing, this is called the Ikea Effect. So people get more value, see more value in Ikea furniture because they've got to put the damn stuff together when they get home, and so that makes it feel valuable to them in some sort of way. When we have to expend effort, it actually creates value, and so that makes those, makes the cause, it makes the purpose more valuable, and we're more likely to contribute more money to it as well. So this, in a sense, this effort creating value is what happens with social groups as well. So when we go through effort, it makes that group more valuable in some way. That's one explanation. But I think there's also other explanations as well. So we ran a study where we had people do painful activities versus very similar but non-painful activities together. Buckets of ice. We got them to eat hot chilies in one study, and then we asked them to engage in a cooperation game where they could choose numbers and they'd win money, or they could win money, but only I guess the game was set up such that if they choose higher numbers, they can get more money, but only if everybody else chose higher numbers as well. And if anybody was a free rider and chose a low number, which would guarantee them a sort of moderate amount of money, everyone else would lose out. So you kind of need the whole group to move together in order to maximize gains. So it's a trust game, it's a cooperation game. So we found that people who had shared the painful experiences together were more likely to choose the higher numbers. They believed, they trusted the rest of the group would come along with them and cooperate towards that end. And I don't think that in that study, I don't think that was just about creating value, but and look, we haven't really found the answer to what's going on there, but I think it's got something to do with the fact that sometimes these sorts of experiences put us in quite a position of authenticity. It's very hard to be inauthentic when you are going through a painful experience, whether that's physical or mental. I think at a moment of failure, it's very hard to be inauthentic about that, unless you pretend you didn't fail. So sometimes these sorts of experiences strip us, I think, of our some of our sort of our camouflage, if you like, and can create a lot of authenticity. But we don't have evidence for that. But that's my best guess at some of it. So on one hand, it creates, engaging in painful acts can create a lot of value. And the other, I think, it also brings people together through being more authentic and more grounded together as well.
It certainly resonates when you, I suppose, at least anecdotally, when you look at groups or individuals within groups in places like, Tesla Motor Company, where they're expected to fail. There's a high risk, and there's really an asking from management of working harder or longer hours, of working together, and that others are saying you're not going to get by, and everyone's kind of individually at risk because they could be made redundant tomorrow, or we go in together. But it requires trust. It requires that trust we're talking about as a collective. And when some of these things come over the line, it almost feels like there's a cult following there of we're part of the rapid advent of sustainable energy or whatever it might be. There's kind of a movement that goes on, which is that camaraderie. But it's all come through, well, predominantly or significant amounts come from pain, and together and trust and putting some skin in the game.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know that in Silicon Valley, if you hadn't failed, no one's interested in you. You haven't learned the lessons you need to learn. I think these sorts of experiences teach us a lot, and they're very important that way. But I guess also, in those sorts of environments, I mean, what an interesting concept which is getting quite a bit of traction in the organisational world now is this notion of psychological safety. And so this is the idea that that it's actually okay to fail, and that it's a safe place to launch, especially around innovation, to launch big ideas, maybe slightly crazy ideas, ones which will be ultimately have the potential to be innovative, but which also might not and might fall flat. But to feel safe that that that's a place that you can do that, and that people aren't going to pull the carpet from underneath you and deride you for having a silly idea if you do. So this notion that we can kind of make mistakes, throw ideas around, get it wrong, but also then get it right is really, really important for innovation. And I suppose that's again that importance of not always, allowing for some of this negative stuff, this uncomfortable stuff to come into an environment where it's okay to trip up, it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to even to feel bad sometimes, but all of that is actually quite conducive to a positive outcome.
Playing devil's advocate, and I know that you haven't used the word psychological safety in this way, but the devil's advocate would ask a question of, if someone's going through a hard time and we want to give them psychological safety, could it be counterproductive or not conducive where we make the environment really appreciative and understanding and compassionate, and we kind of say, we know that it's stressful for you and you've come and spoken to us, so maybe you do need to take some time off, or balance it up a little bit, and so on and so forth, from kind of like a fear of, I don't want this to escalate or be worse or to cause harm at some point. There's kind of like, let's take it easy. Is there that possibility where maybe workplaces are
absolutely
becoming too, and I'll put out the big word, becoming too soft?
Absolutely, and I think what you just described there is a perfect characterization of how that concept of psychological safety has been misunderstood in many ways, because it's not about keeping people safe and protecting people and wrapping them in cotton wool and not I guess exposing them to the reality of their situation. So I think a psychologically safe environment is one where people are able to be quite open and straightforward with each other and say, look, that was a really bad idea. Sorry, that one, that sucked. Not one which sort of is, so that's what it means. It means you can fail, right? But that doesn't mean you protect people from failing and you stop them from failing and you try and help them to feel like they haven't failed. No, you let them fail miserably and you let them know that they just failed miserably, but that it's okay that they are failing miserably. Pick yourself back up and just keep going.
Yeah. In some sense, I'm hearing you. We're encouraging people to face their fear, which is the pain, the being scared of saying, "Hey, I've got an idea," and if the idea is rejected, that's okay. The psychologically safe space to go out and say, "We want to hear everyone's ideas," because that's important to the growth of the whole team and the organisation and so on. You're not going to be reprimanded for ideas or putting something forward or speaking to another colleague. It's not about, it's about facilitating that sort of space where people can have fear, people can have pain, they're being emotionally scared.
Yeah, that's right. And exactly. So it's not about protecting people. I think that's where the word safe gets really misused. It's where it's actually safe to fall over and, and when you fall over, you'll feel it, and and people will let you know that that was you stumbled in that particular idea there. But so it's actually safe to tell someone that that's a bad idea, as well as it's safe to throw that idea out there in the first place. So it requires quite a lot of people. I mean, certainly a high level kind of concept in some ways. But it's about being quite open and even blunt with people, but with an understanding that there's no judgment there. We're looking at the idea, we're not looking at the person. And I think this same sort of principle can be applied in quite a number of ways in different domains. But I think, again, if you've got an organisation which is focusing very much on the importance of happiness and success and positivity, and that can actually create a lack of psychological safety, because in a sense that organisation doesn't provide space for people to not feel happy or to fail or to make mistakes or to get it wrong. It doesn't provide that space. Of course, we're not going to kind of forever, people have to sometimes get it right as well, and they do have to move forward. Can't encourage failure endlessly. There is a reality to that as well, but it allows for that to happen and doesn't expect that people should always be on one side of the equation.
How does expectation setting play into this space, with the organisations or, management or in personal relationships?
Or
even this expectation might be, this happiness. I know that your book, The Other Side of Happiness, is really talking in some sense around expectations. How does that fit in?
Yeah, well, I think it's very much around this idea that if we do expect to experience happiness, and we have that expectation set up for us, and I will say that I think that expectation is set up for us in many kinds of ways. So, I mean, if you ever look at advertising, you walk through a shopping centre, you won't see a sort of disappointed, dull, kind of slightly unhappy looking face next to any product in that shopping centre, right? Nor on the internet, nor on the television. The amount of the level of excitement that people have over in advertising over buying dishwashing detergent is quite astonishing, right? I mean, this is a wow, dishwashing detergent. So we're constantly sold on this idea that people around us are experiencing these, not just happiness, I mean extreme happiness, and that advertisers are using this to sell products. Of course they want to. I mean, if I see someone with dishwashing detergent looking quite disappointed, I probably won't buy it. So they do use this, but again, inadvertently, it's leading to this, setting up this expectation that, hey, everyone's always feeling, look at all these faces around me, look at all these billboards, look at all these people looking at me. They're always looking happy, and why aren't I always feeling this way? Social media is another one. I mean, we don't post images of ourselves looking sort of a bit disappointed, or we don't advertise our failures on LinkedIn. We don't sort of. I mean, some people do, and I think that's good, but really ultimately we portray a particular image of ourselves on social media. And so again, when people get on social media, when they look at Instagram and they're seeing people on these wonderful holidays doing wonderful things, and they don't always feel that way themselves, it sets up this expectation that the rest of the world is like this, and I'm somehow inconsistent. My experiences are not the same as what other people's experiences are. And I suppose also when we're not able to talk openly about these things, and people don't feel, they don't feel confident to be able to share those elements of their lives, again, perhaps because this norm has been set up that we should always be trying to just share those positive moments, or we should be expressing positivity to each other. Again, it leaves that sense of feeling quite isolated and lonely. And certainly in our own research, we found that, to the extent to which people feel that those expectations are in their social environment, when they do feel depressed, they also feel more lonely. They feel disconnected, as you would expect, because they're not matching, they're not fitting in with what they think is the norm and what is expected of them, what other people expect them to do. So, yeah, expectation is massive. And of course, individually as well, we know that if you set your expectation for happiness, along the way that humans work, you're going to assess whether or not you're meeting that expectation. And of course, in that space between not quite meeting your expectation and, in that space, there is some disappointment. And so ironically, what happens is that as you assess, am I as happy as I expect I should be, you actually become less and less happy because your disappointment builds rather than your happiness. You're actually fostering disappointment there rather than fostering happiness. So I think setting expectations around how we should feel is quite dangerous. And it tends to be quite counterproductive, both individually, but also in organisations and or in society at large as well.
How about expecting pain? On that side of things, of expecting that something will go wrong, expecting that I'm going to have arguments with my wife, manager, expecting that I'm going to go through some low, dull patches, something that really goes out and is always something that I look upon positively is and I'm always excited by, is when someone from more rural area comes to see me in my clinic.
Yeah.
Almost always that they have a certain level of resilience, or at least it appears that way.
Yeah.
They kind of expect that there's going to be some hardship, or they've certainly been through a fair bit of hardship, because rural life often means very early mornings, lots of hard labour, things changing all the time, so on and so. It's not an easy life. They almost expect that, hey, it's if it's going to go wrong, it will, and that's okay as well. How does the expectation on the negative side work?
Well, I think it works differently, probably because we don't expect to. Well, I guess if we expected to always be in pain, we might be depressed. But we don't expect to always be. We just expect that it might happen, and that's quite a good and healthy expectation to have. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, what that does is it sets up the willingness to have those experiences and to see them as part of life, and maybe even important at some in some way. So and you mentioned resilience there, and I think that's a really important one, because I think it's very, the idea of how do we build resilience, how do we become resilient, is effectively a question about exposure to these sorts of events. So that if when we know that people are more resilient if they've had a moderate amount of lifetime adversity than if they've had too much they've had too much, they tend to become traumatized and they become, weakened. But if they haven't had any or very little, they're equally not very resilient. So, resilience is, I think, a little bit like, it's a bit like immunization. If you want to build the body to be able to respond well to a pathogen, you have to provide a little bit of that pathogen to the system in order for it to know how to cope. I think it's the same with psychological immunization, if you like, and the way that we respond to the world. We need these experiences, these setbacks. We need to be able to deal with stresses in daily life, and that's what, it's that exposure to those events which actually builds our resilience. A lack of exposure undermines our resilience. So again, expecting these things will happen, and when they do, having the tools to step into them and to I guess engage with them productively rather than unproductively, allows for that resilience to build. It allows us to respond with efficacy, and that's quite, I think, an important part of becoming, building those strengths that we need to get through life well.
Is there a certain amount of sort of pain that has been shown to be useful, effective? Is it about frequency? Is it about intensity? Is it particular areas? I mean, just thinking about how to raise kids, or maybe as an adult, should I go out and try and bring a bit more pain into my life? How do I do this? What's some of the research saying, or what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think how much is a hard question, because it probably varies a lot by people, and it's a very subjective thing. So I don't think that you can sort of say, right, well, here's 5 painful things you should employ on a daily basis or anything like that. But I think it's just about being, well, firstly, I think it's about changing our perspective on it, so we can see that those benefits are there, and then maybe that changes how we orient towards that experience, and maybe we become more inclined to expose to expose ourselves to those sorts of risks in life. I guess maybe it also allows us to see the importance of allowing our kids to be exposed to those sorts of risks in life as well. And I think actually, one of the things that has happened is that, we talk about over parenting, overprotective parenting, helicopter parenting, and in that sense, the mollycoddling of our children, where we are wrapping them in cotton wool, not exposing them to the right sorts of risks in life, so they become more depressed, more anxious, less resilient. And this is, there's evidence for this. But I actually think that what underlies that is our own inability to deal with our own anxiety around what might happen to our children. And speaking as a father, I'm probably as much to blame, for that kind of way of thinking as anybody else. I think in our world we're able to protect ourselves. We like to think we can protect ourselves against these risks, and so we extend that to our children. We think, well, we should protect our children from all of these risks as well. Trouble is, they grow up not knowing how to deal with any of them, and then they do become exposed to those risks, those issues in life, and they don't know what to do. They become more likely to be depressed. I mean, there's good evidence that the kids have less experiences these days than they used to. They're getting their driver's license later. They're having sex later. I mean, that's probably, all of us go, thank God for that as parents. At the same time, they're not having those sorts of experiences that perhaps we did. They're staying indoors more. They're on screens more. That comes with its own risks. So I think there is an important link there between our own tolerance of risk in our own emotional lives and how we're treating our children, and maybe partly that's born of our own tendency to pad our own lives quite comfortably, or our ability to as well. I mean, we live in a world nowadays where we've got an incredible capacity to deliver comfort, to exist in comfort. I mean, if you think about the way that we live, and you just compare that to a country less advanced than we are, or go back in history 400 years or 300 years or 200 years. I mean, our lives are very comfortable today, particularly in Australia. We have an incredible level of comfort, from shoes that are comfortable to cars with cushioned seats to, we can have air conditioning and climate controlled temperature almost 24/7. We get upset when we don't have it. So we have a lot of comfort in our lives. And so, do we need to then step out of that sometimes intentionally, and people do. You see people doing this all the time. People are going out there doing these what is it, the Tough Mudder events on the weekends, and finding ways to expose themselves to risk and adventure and difficulty, and because we know we need to. We actually find that's a way of getting meaning and enjoyment in our lives. So we actually are intentionally seeking out these sorts of experiences quite frequently, and perhaps again we do it because we live in a world of luxury, and we need to sometimes step outside of that to experience some really important parts of life.
It seems like a world where we do have a fair bit of control over luxury, over comfort.
Yeah.
But that has its own magnetism to more comforts, less, for lack of a better word, less tolerance. I know that obviously the acceptance and commitment therapy doesn't like that word in particular, but in some sense that's what happens. We hold, well, my apologies, let me rephrase it. We don't mind that word tolerance, because that's what people are doing. They're becoming intolerant. It's about white knuckling, it's about control.
Yeah.
The more we try and control pain or reduce pain, worse it gets. We become, rather than vaccinated to it, where it's kind of like you need boosters, you need regular boosters of this vaccination. We kind of say, well, I haven't had my booster for a long time, and so a small flu might get me.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Or maybe
I think that's the way we have to. Yeah, I think that's the way we have to think about it, because the fact is, even though we've got all of this comfort, there's still things in our environment which are going to shock us from time to time. We can't protect entirely against that, and so what we find is, like with anything. I mean, like with the way that the antibiotics work. The more you use them, the stronger some of those antibiotic-resistant viruses become. So, in the same way, we can pad our lives out, but it does mean that the stronger those shocks are when they do come. So it is important to sometimes step into that space and to have a few of those shocks in our lives to be able to know how to respond to them, and also to recognise that actually they are quite valuable too. It's not just so that we can deal better with those things, but actually they provide us with a range of really important elements in our lives. I mean, our own research shows that if you get people to think back 6 to 12 months, you ask them, what was the most meaningful experience? Tell me about a really meaningful experience that happened to you in the last 6 to 12 months. What we find is the most meaningful experiences are not only the most pleasant, but also the most unpleasant. So it's about intensity. So I think these days we have this interesting idea that we should all be sort of becoming, somehow Buddhist monks, mindful, calm, stress-free, never exposed, floating through life without any perturbations or whatever else, just never sort of ruffled. And yet it's exactly when we're ruffled, whether it be through intense positive experiences or intense negative experiences, that we think that was a really meaningful experience. That was something that shaped me, made me who I am. It's something I remember and I recall. And when asked what's meaningful in your life, it's those experiences we go to.
It's interesting because Buddhist monks have an extraordinary amount of pain.
Yes,
most of us absolutely hate sitting still.
Yes,
right, for 20 minutes, let alone an hour.
Yes.
Maybe do that 6 times a day, along with a whole lot of other things, day after day. We find that absolutely unbearable. I mean, they have probably, I might go out and argue that they have more pain than any, than a lot of us.
That's a good point.
Incredibly painful exercise.
Yeah, that's right. And so, this idea of, I think this recent, trend in mindfulness, again, what we tend to do is we take those elements which we kind of, are kind of positive and nice and easy and pleasant, and we go, well, let's all be mindful. But actually the way that they're trained for mindfulness, and this is a lot in yoga too, is using a certain amount of pain in order to provide that resistance and to train the mind to be able to focus elsewhere and to be able to, to manage that in a way. So again, I think that mindfulness is probably. I think I'm personally pretty bad at meditating or doing mindful activities, but I find that during a run, I think that for me is my mindfulness space, because it's really very, very hard for me to worry about much when I'm just thinking about how am I going to get up this hill and down the next one without, and how far am I from home now, and I'm very present. I'm incredibly present in that moment.
my legs.
Exactly. So it serves that purpose as well, and it's sort of a. I mean, I've been cheeky enough to call pain a shortcut to mindfulness, because it actually is a way of capturing our attention. And when we are exercising intensely and with a certain amount of resistance there, it's a great way to keep ourselves out of the future and the past. It really brings us into the present and makes us deal with what's right here and right now. And so sometimes the easiest way and the most expedient way to become present is not to be surrounded by pleasant aromas and soft noises, but actually to be quite challenged.
Is there a generalizing effect? So, for example, you talk about going for a run. If you go out and push yourself where your legs, ache, they hurt a bit more than usual. You're pushing the limit somewhat. Does that help you in other areas because you've been able to kind of go through that pain? Does it then make other things a little bit easier to handle, or does it kind of just be, is it just specific to that task? So, now that I've done, I've run this far at this pace, it helps me to run that far at that pace, easier next time, or, continue on that growth. Or does it go beyond that?
I think there's definitely. I mean, we're actually in the process of doing some research on this in sort of everyday kinds of experiences, and whether or not, exactly that. Being exposed to this sort of experience here might lead me to be better at dealing with a different kind of experience, and whether I can bring, certain resilience factors that I've used here and also practice here, whether they become stronger over a different context, or even whether other resilience factors emerge as a function of that too. What we do know is that there's some research again showing that people who've experienced a moderate amount of lifetime adversity, and this means parents breaking up, maybe experiencing a car accident, the death of a loved one. I mean, these are fairly difficult experiences that people have had in life. And when you ask people about how many of those sorts of experiences they've had, there was 2 studies by a researcher in America called Mark Seary, who showed that in one study, he showed that people, again, who had that moderate amount of lifetime adversity had high levels of well-being. And also, he was lucky enough to be surveying people around September 11. So he also found that people with a moderate amount of lifetime adversity were better at responding to the stress of September 11. So they showed, I guess, less reactivity to that as a function of having some prior exposure to difficult life events. And then he even showed, bringing it into the lab, that if you got people to put their hand into a bucket of ice and hold it there, that the people with a moderate amount of lifetime adversity not only held their hand in there longer than people with little lifetime adversity, they were better at tolerating that pain, but also they catastrophized it less than people with a lot of lifetime adversity. So they were, that moderate amount was enough to help people to, I guess, respond well to an acute stressor in the lab, a painful experience in the lab, and to have the best response, to be able to not only persevere, but persevere without catastrophizing, without feeling overwhelmed by it. So, I think that evidence is certainly there, and we're continuing to try and build in our studies whether or not just, as you say, dealing with the difficulty of a run on a daily basis might actually lead to better functioning throughout that day, to more resilient responding throughout that day.
Brings you back to that analogy, or not, that idea of someone who might be living more rural. If I grab a farmer and say, here's a bucket of ice, put your hand in it. My thoughts are, they'd say, yeah, and what, and then what? How long can you hold in there for? Well, as long as you want, until my hand falls out, like it almost feels like it wouldn't probably even strike them very much. It would just be like, well, sure I can. as where someone else who maybe hasn't had much, or has lots of comfort in their life might kind of already start worrying. Would it be 1 minute? Would it be 2 minutes? They're already starting to actually become aroused. A little bit anxious about how they might go, and so it's very different. Obviously, I'm just talking anecdotally, but it seems like it would be that way.
Yeah, look, I think you're right, and I think it also not only attracts from that sort of physical comfort to the ability to tolerate physical discomfort, but also tracks across the emotional spectrum as well. So that I think even having those physically uncomfortable experiences or dealing with some of that difficulty would also help us to be able to know how to manage anxiety and stress and how to respond well to situations emotionally as well as physically. Of course, these things are all interlinked anyway, but yeah, so I do think there is a generalising effect there, and we're continuing to build the evidence for it.
Mm-hmm. Would it be reasonable to suggest that some of the data is therefore suggesting that if life isn't giving us adversity, that life is fairly comfortable, there may be some benefit in actively going out and creating conditions in which we experience pain, obviously not harm, but we push that pain. So, for example, the difference between going for a run and going for a run to the point of pain, or maybe even running with pain for a period, not to damage, joints and so on, but going through the lactic acid pain sort of spaces, that could be beneficial. Or let's say, having standing in the shower for 5 seconds while it's colder than you would usually have a shower. But even that adversity might give you some feeling of mastery or confidence, or
Well, I've got data to speak to that if you like, because we've got an unpublished study where we had people have a cold shower in the morning. Now this was actually conducted in Brisbane, so it wasn't really that hard. We tried to do it in winter, but it slowly became summer as we were running the study. So I think towards the end, people were quite happy to have a cold shower in the mornings. But what we found there was that having that shower led to an increased sense of self-efficacy, and then via that self-efficacy across the day, that people experienced more positive affect as a result of that. So certainly we've actually exactly tested that, and I think you're right when it comes to running. I mean, we know that exercise is an excellent treatment for depression, anxiety, affective disturbances. We know that and I think that it's not just because it makes us fitter and healthier. I think it's probably there's probably a real quite a range of reasons. I mean, right down to the fact that it actually releases releases opioids and dopamine and all of those reward-based feel-good chemicals as a result of a run. And in actual fact, the more that you run, the harder you run. I mean, that's what's called the runner's high. You literally get high after a run if you push hard enough. So there, I think, and then the sense of efficacy and the ability, the sense of your own ability to be able to tolerate and endure something like that. There's a whole lot of levels at which it works. But we know that intense exercise, physical exercise, is very, very good for affective disturbances. And I think that what we're talking about here plays directly into that equation.
So maybe when thinking about, at least from a psychologist's perspective, when thinking about this idea of exercise, not suggesting that there aren't lots of great benefits from that, but encouraging maybe clients to exercise to get to the point of discomfort, of point of pain, and then staying in pain for a period, whether it be a minute, whether it be whatever the client's able to tolerate. It could be 5 minutes. But we know that potentially with increasing pain thresholds, there might be greater self-efficacy. So that, if someone can tolerate 10 seconds versus someone who can tolerate a minute versus someone who can tolerate 10 minutes, they're building on that efficacy and saying, wow. And also being able to feel the difference, the other side of happiness, is pain.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. So, and again, I mean, runners and sports people talk about good pain and bad pain. I think, the distinction there is the bad pain is where you start to feel your foot give way and, your ankle is actually, is actually getting an injury. That's when you should stop. That's the pain you listen to and you say, okay, that's time for me to stop. I'm going to injure myself here. But the good pain is the pain that you're able to experience as a part of that exercise, which is not, not about a significant injury, but rather about the fact that you're pushing your muscles, your body, in a way which is actually causing quite a bit of resistance.
Apologies to the interruption to this podcast. Unfortunately, halfway through, my internet connection had some issues, some tech problems have arisen. So what we've done is we're just going to try and stitch together the first part and the second part of the interview together. Apologies, however, because it had to be recorded over two different interviews, as we didn't realise until the editing process that half of the interview was not up to scratch with breaks in audio and the like. So we'll try and continue on with the episode as cleanly as we can. So back over to part two of the interview. Brock, I was wondering, in terms of this idea of the difference between emotional and physical pain, is there one that is more effective? I mean, I know when I think about my experience in the army, there were two components. One was certainly a lot of running and, taking us away from sleep, depriving us in that sort of space. Certainly a lot of that yelling, maybe that's a bit of an emotional sort of breakdown, putting us down and the like. There was also stuff where we were asked to, climb tall structures and jump off while obviously, attached safely, with a carabiner and rope. But ask us to face, pain, face fear. Is there one that's more, I suppose, productive toward bringing that greater state of confidence or self-efficacy or happiness even?
Yeah. So I guess the first part is, are these things different or similar? And I guess the thing is that they're similar to the extent that they both occur in the brain. And so our experience of physical pain is one which is ultimately a psychological experience, and that recognition of that was what allowed people to start to see that, actually the way that we think and feel and other kinds of broader psychological factors can really impact on our experience of physical pain. But again, I guess which of those is going to influence our happiness, our resilience, our well-being more. I suppose the easiest way to think about what kinds of experiences you might seek out to achieve that would be quite often physical ones, where you have to endure something physical. Of course, there's obviously emotion attached to that as well, potentially a sense of being challenged, fear. I guess the notion this is going to be very difficult, and am I going to be able to cope, and all of those sorts of thoughts and feelings attached to it. But again, seeking out those physical experiences seems the most obvious and natural paths through which you might want to build some of these sorts of things into your life. And I think again, it's probably less likely that you might seek out social rejection or something like that. It's a little more, maybe that's a harder experience to want to seek out and to grow from. But then again, I mean, if you do think about it, we sometimes do that. So, when I was young, I went traveling by myself for a period of time. And, there were moments of quite intense loneliness. And I think that was a really important part of that trip. Was I later went traveling with a companion, and I think that trip on my own had, was more of a growth experience for me than when I was with somebody, because I had to learn to be alone. I had to learn to feel that loneliness and then also to resolve it, to meet people, to get through that. So in some ways we do sort of seek out an absence of social relationships, maybe not rejection and ostracism from other people, but maybe we take ourselves away from people sometimes in solitary kind of worlds and experiences. course, there are a range of other sorts of ways that people seek out experiences, whether it be through, you know, movies that involve fearful or negative, sad, scary content. Whether or not we see these as ways to build resilience, we probably don't, and probably they don't necessarily do it. I don't think watching more gory movies is going to make us happier and healthier and, you know, more and stronger in life. But again, we do seek out those experiences because we get some enjoyment from them. So I suppose, I mean, people seek out these experiences, they employ them in different ways. We do traditionally or easily see the link between, I guess, challenging ourselves physically, though I think that's the most natural domain in which we kind of, you know, think about this stuff and probably enact it as well.
It's interesting, while you're talking, my mind's kind of racing around in terms of looking at, you know, context is so important. You know, obviously movies, generally speaking, I watch for entertainment. Having said that, someone might be quite, in actual fact, frightened of watching, you know, horror scenes, and by actually going out and actively seeking them out to sit with that discomfort, that could be kind of a position of building self-efficacy or you know, self-empowerment, and the context changes it from entertainment to doing something, you know, working on myself, or that idea of, you know, no one seeks social rejection, you know, in terms of, you know, being rude to someone else so that someone is rude to you, for example. But it tends to be, I suppose, in some sense, our fear of social rejection means that we don't seek social contact. We kind of pull back and rather than, and I know this because I get this at conferences all the time. I get highly self-conscious in a conference. You know, I stand by myself. I think everyone's going and judging me, and, you know, I'm a loner and a loser, and I never fit into these sorts of things, and all that normal stuff. And, you know, my job, if I want to go out and have some growth, I suppose, or increase that pain, is to walk over to someone who's probably also standing there by themselves and say, "Hey, how you going? My name's Nesh. You know, what brings you to this conference? Why do you enjoy this?" Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one thing you've identified there is, you know, I mean, we know this is a long trend in therapy, is exposure therapy. So exposing yourself to the things you fear, and so movies can do that in some sort of way, and certainly going and talking to people at conferences. I once did a training course in behavioural experiments, you know, as a form of intervention, and at lunchtime we were all sort of challenged to go and do something a little bit sort of outside of our comfort zones. And some people went and sang in Myers. I came up with this rather innocuous example where I was going to go and ask people what the temperature was, because it was kind of not a normal thing to ask people. You know, obviously I was really branching out with that. You know, and what we were asked to do is make predictions about what we thought how people would respond. So my prediction was people would get annoyed and angry with me that I was asking such a stupid question. The first person that I asked ran away anxiously. And the second, so not angry or, you know, just a bit worried about me. And the second person just laughed along and went with the joke. Well, didn't even laugh, just went with it, and you know, had a good time with it. So, you know, sometimes that's a good thing to do as well, is to make these predictions about what we think, what our fears tell us might be the case, and then expose ourselves to those experiences and update our predictions accordingly. And often things we're anxious or worried about, you know, such as the examples you gave, we're often going to make I guess a prediction there which is inaccurate, probably in favour of the anxiety rather than reality. So yeah, there are plenty of social ways and even sort of, you know, even maybe via entertainment where we can again increase that exposure to these experiences which do challenge us, and through that, I guess, build some capacity to engage with them more easily, more productively, with less anxiety and worry. Yeah. It reminds me of a scene in a movie, Fight Club, if you've ever seen that, where the main character asks, you know, the members of the club to, you know, go out this week pick a fight with someone and lose it, and then all the next scenes are, maybe a guy watering the garden, and as a neighbor walks past or something, squirting the guy with the water, trying to, pick a fight. And interestingly, it's very hard for people to engage in these sorts of things. It's not easy for someone to for example, get angry or annoyed or whatever it might be, but it creates a fear. It's a fear of, I don't want to pick a fight, or, I don't want to go and approach someone and be rejected.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So again, putting ourselves in those experiences in small ways helps to build that ability to to feel more comfortable in those experiences, and also again, just to probably correct and update our predictions about what really is going to be the outcome too.
And that links in with that voluntary stuff in terms of, if I'm voluntarily doing it rather than I'm being forced, I'm voluntarily moving into pain rather than, being harmed by being forced. So that self sort of willingness, if you will, is important in that space, whether it be therapeutic or, challenging oneself to run further, or keep your heart rate at a certain level, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, so certainly control and choice are very, very important, and those experiences always feel less adverse, more manageable when we have control and choice as part of it. We feel in charge of what's going on. Absolutely, yeah.
Is part of the I suppose the message or the thesis of your book, The Other Side of Happiness, that in terms of maybe people can develop a willingness to go out and either put themselves in that space, or is it about trying to accept more of that when it shows up? Where do you think the message is, or a bit of both? How do you kind of formulate that?
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and I always, in fact, I was very worried that the message, because it is, the message is a little bit sort of more naturally aligned with people who might go and seek out these sorts of experiences. So I know that that people in extreme sports, or gym junkies, or these sorts of guys, but they've certainly connected with the message in the book, more broadly as well. But certainly, those people who do want to go out and seek out these experiences and find benefit in them certainly found some messages there. But when I was, in the process, and in fact before the book was published, even just in the research that I'd been doing, I was always a little bit worried about how it would be taken in the pain community, in the chronic pain community, because certainly the last thing you want to tell someone who's experiencing chronic pain, in this case I'm talking physical, but I think it's the same if it's an emotional, is that
absolutely
their experience is somehow good for them. That's the way to pick a fight, I think, is but then I got an invitation to the British Pain Society to talk at one of their conferences, and I was almost a bit worried that they were going to kind of roll me out and crucify me, but it wasn't the case at all. And in fact, people connected in that area quite a lot as well, because they and I got comments and things from people on various things I wrote on the web, or emails from people who were able to I guess put a different framework around the pain that they had in their lives, even when they hadn't chosen it. So if you're one message here is that it's actually very functional and effective to go out and expose yourself to these sorts of experiences, to push yourself, to challenge yourself through engaging with things which can be painful, difficult, adverse, anxiety-provoking, up to a point. And this can be quite a productive way to actually build resilience, well-being, and happiness in life. But also, we're exposed to those sorts of experiences without choosing to be, frequently as well. And if you walk into that experience with a very black and white view that, well, this is just a bad thing that's happened to me, this is just a terrible thing that's happened to me, well, it will just feel bad and terrible, and you won't respond to it or bounce off it very well at all. In fact, it'll probably sort of encompass you. But if you have a different kind of framework to apply to that, so this is a bad thing, I wish it didn't happen, but as a part of it, I can also see the other opportunities that have opened up. Would I overall prefer not to have this experience? Absolutely. Well, it never happened. But given it's happened, given I've got to confront it and I've got to lean into it somehow, having some frameworks to think through it from a different perspective, to give it some nuance, to see another side to it, is actually, I think, people find that quite helpful. And I think that, I think, again, anything that we see in this sort of black and white way is not a very adaptive way of looking at the world. And so we've seen pain in a very black and white way. Pain is bad. We need to get rid of it. But actually, maybe it's not all bad. And then if that's the case, what are the benefits? And can we find them in some sort of way? And does that make our experience of that pain easier and better? And even maybe there are parts of it which lead us to grow in some way, even if we haven't chosen it.
And that's what's so hard about this topic, and maybe what keeps people afraid and scared to discuss this, that if it's misunderstood or the nuance isn't quite there, the distinctions around pain that might be helpful and pain that's less helpful, or even opening our mind or trying to see a different perspective of how pain could serve, it can go out and rub people the wrong way. I know that in my own life I've had extremely expensive, pain lessons to learn. That's how I tend to formulate it. I kind of go, this is a lesson, and it's just come in the form of extreme, cost, whether it be, emotional, whether it be time, whether it be, heartache, whether it be, financial. There's a great cost to that. And I suppose the way I try and reconcile that, at least, is it does go out and provide me with an opportunity to learn. So that, maybe that kind of helps me. But that, I suppose the concern is a lot of people will very easily say, I reject that claim. That doesn't work for me. And we're not saying that has to work for everyone. That's not what the thesis is.
No, I mean, a weak form of the thesis is, some people are going to find that this works for them more than others. I think a stronger form is that actually it's just how happiness works. And in fact, even if we're not aware of it, we're all doing it to some degree. And if we're not doing it enough, then maybe we're not as happy as we could be. So it is how it works. It is how it works. But it is a hard message. And indeed, the editors at Penguin said, Brock, how are we going to sell a book on pain to people? Let's call it The Other Side of Happiness.
You've got to inject the word of happiness in it, right?
So, a book on happiness. What's the other side, I wonder? Pain. It's not perhaps the easiest or obvious, most obvious kind of feel-good message for people. But at the same time, anyone who's, been in an experience that's required a different perspective, or who's perhaps also pushed and found the benefits to these sorts of experiences has latched onto it. And I think also people are a little bit sick of the idea that we can just kind of continue to engender sort of positivity and upward spirals of happier and happier and more positive feelings, which itself, as I've argued in the book, has the downside of leading us to respond badly to those negative experiences when they do happen. We think, well, why am I feeling sad? I should be an upward spiral of positivity. What's gone wrong? What's wrong with me? And so I think anyone who's even exposed, perhaps run the gauntlet on the positive thinking side of things has come around to see that actually you need to look at this differently. It's not working when you look at it that way. So so maybe in a sort of a world full of hedonists, it's a hard message to sell. We are living in a world, all of us in a world full of hedonists, I think, in some degree at the moment. So.
For me personally, I'm actually excited by it and optimistic and inspired, because I feel that connection seems to me like it's very strong, that the data's there. How we do therapy certainly suggests the more visceral, the more we can ask our clients to activate that limbic system, which effectively means get emotional, right? Feel the pain, kind of step towards the pain, the more effective therapy is.
Yeah.
I think there's so many links, whether it be systematic desensitization or that willingness, whether it be exposure therapy. I think all of these things are quite nuanced about a willingness and putting yourself forward and for what reason. All of those things are very, very inspiring. But this message, I think, helps us simplify it even more of just saying, pain is important. We need to, in some sense, have a capacity to be able to thrust ourselves, if you will, into that space because it's good for us. This growth that comes from it, even though it might not, even though it's frightening. I think it's an optimistic message.
Yeah, and it's certainly, the idea is not to stay there either. I mean, it's not like you want to hold yourself in that place, but you have to dip into it. You have to step into it, and sometimes when it's coming towards you, you've got to lean into it. And then that's the best way to cope with it and to deal with it. So so I think it's sort of needed.
And there's an interesting gentleman that has written a book and has been kind of given or dubbed a title of World's Toughest Man. His name is David Goggins. And something interesting about the work he does, or something that jumped out for me, he's like a American Navy SEAL, and he's done ultra marathons and so on and so forth. But there's this term that he talks about, which is building a mental callus. And it's not necessarily doing one thing. It's actually putting a layer upon a layer upon a layer, the same way you'd put a callus on your hands. We're trying to put a mental callus on, doing something that's difficult or challenging or hard or whatever that might be. And it could be, learning a language. It doesn't necessarily have to be, challenging myself physically, but he too, sees that link between, that cheeky sort of idea of a shortcut to mindfulness is through physical pain. So I think you're definitely, the way that you say it is so elegant and coming from your background is so powerful.
Oh, thank you. I do like the idea of mental callus, and I'm going to. I think it's a nice way of framing it. Really, you develop a callus, which is a toughness. I mean, that idea of toughness is quite important as well. And even culturally and socially these days, I think there's been a tendency to focus on. This is starting to come through in a few social commentators. A tendency to focus on protecting people from I guess not exposing them or allowing them to experience their weaknesses, or to even to sort of identify with various different vulnerabilities, and to see that as who we are, that we're vulnerable, we need to be protected. And I think that increasingly is causing problems, and certainly been identified in universities in America, and I think even some of the even in the school generation currently in Australia, that there is a tendency to step away from this and to see ourselves in this kind of this space of vulnerability and the need for protection, rather than sometimes doing a little bit more what actually people are quite good at doing in honour cultures, where you have to earn that respect from others. You have to actually step into that space in order to gain respect from other people. And whether that's the right thing or not, I don't know, but it's certainly when it plays out in terms of how people orient towards these sorts of experiences in life, I think that idea of having to step into it, having to earn, interesting one to consider. And we've sort of lost it a little bit, and we sort of feel, well, no, I should be respected no matter what, and I don't need to sometimes earn or prove myself. And certainly in the army, that's the way that it plays out there. You have to earn the respect. Should we have to earn respect from people? I don't know. But again, it has an interesting interplay with how we approach these sorts of experiences and how we think we should be approaching these sorts of experiences in life.
It's fascinating from that cultural point of view, because there are, historically, rituals to manhood, whether it's through physical mutilation, scarring of the skin and so on. And so there's a lot of things that do involve pain. And it's almost at this transition of, you will now go through a transition or through a ritual that's going to demonstrate that you're a man. And in some sense, maybe it goes out and says it's going to at least start a process of greater and greater exposure, and once you're in that passage, will allow you to do other things that or pain or responsibility that creates that. But it's fascinating. Where can we go out and find your book, get a copy of your book? I think there's going to be a really important piece for a lot of people to go and do some more research on, because it's important we have a starting point.
Yeah, look, I think any of the online places have it, Amazon or whatever else we go to and use in Australia. So yeah, it's I think you certainly order it anywhere online, and I think it's still in a few bookshops. It was released in 2018, so it's been a couple of years, but certainly online's an easy place to find it.
Excellent.
So,
And what's next for you?
Yeah, that's always an interesting question. Look, I'm still thinking around what when you've had a go at a book, is there another one? It's always a lingering question, which maybe never gets answered, or maybe it does. But been pondering a few ideas that could or couldn't maybe lead to that. So we'll see. But at the moment, I'm just I'm enjoying some the research I do here and some of the consulting work I do externally, and kind of keeping all that going. So that's fun, and some of the counselling work I do as well. So variety, enjoying the variety of life.
It's a cheeky question. It's almost like, do you want to go through that suffering and pain again?
Yeah, I won't say there wasn't a bit of that involved. So yeah.
Look, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast, and I think your insights are, absolutely amazing. And I do also need to apologise for the tech difficulties and hiccup in the middle of this, but we were able to pick up from. Yeah. If you're watching online, don't be confused about why my dress is all different, or our dress. So, but yeah, appreciate it, and thanks again for your time.
No worries. Thank you, Nesh.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience, and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.